Hello everyone and welcome to episode 13 of The Power of Books. My name is Timo Jübner, I'm the founder of Timo's Notes, and every week I interview popular non-fiction authors about their best-selling books. The goal of the show is to introduce you to new books and to provide you with helpful advice and practical tools. My guest today is Brad Stulberg. Brad is a researcher, writer and coach on the characteristics that underlie sustainable excellence and well-being. His books Peak Performance and The Practice of Groundedness have sold more than 250,000 copies, and his writing has appeared in well-known publications like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. In the Principles of Groundedness, Brad shares a more sustainable and healthier model for success by interweaving modern science with time-honored lessons from ancient wisdom traditions like Buddhism or Stoicism. From our conversation today, you can expect to learn a simple equation for happiness, how you can and why you should train your patience, how to make movement part of your day if you work an office job, and a lot more. So now let's get right into our conversation. Enjoy the show. Brad Stulberg, welcome to the Power of Books podcast.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm very excited about our conversation. We're going to talk about your book, The Practice of Groundedness. And to get the listeners to understand what we're going to talk about today, I want to start with a very simple question. What does groundedness mean?
So I like to think about groundedness using the metaphor of a mountain. And when you imagine in your mind's eye a big, beautiful mountain, most people immediately think about its peak, high up in the clouds. And perhaps if the mountain is really steep and prominent, they might imagine its slope, the side of the mountain. But very rarely when people think about a mountain or when they come across a mountain out in real life, do they consider its base. Yeah, it's the base of a mountain that holds it to the ground throughout all kinds of weather. There is no beautiful peak, there is no rise without a really solid foundation. Otherwise, that mountain is fragile, it can crumble, it can fall. And we humans are the same way. We tend to focus so disproportionately on our metaphorical peaks and our rises, on all the bright and shiny objects in our lives, and often we don't focus as much as we should, or sometimes we neglect completely to focus on the base, these foundational qualities that really are what give rise to any sense of peak that we might accomplish later on. So groundedness is about the supportive, foundational base qualities that eventually can give rise to sustainable excellence.
Interesting. And you outline in your book, you outline 6 different principles that probably, make that groundedness complete. And one thing that you start explaining in the beginning of the book, which kind of is, I guess, the foundation of all this, is what you call heroic individualism. What is that?
So heroic individualism is the game of one-upsmanship that we play against both ourselves and other people, where measurable achievement is the main, if not only, arbiter of success. And the thing with heroic individualism is no matter how far you make it, the finish line is always 10 yards down the field. So you can fall for this fallacy. Behavioral scientists actually call it the arrival fallacy, where you think, if I just accomplish this goal, then I'll be content. If I just launch this business, then I'll be at peace. If I just reach 100,000 followers on Instagram, then I'll feel good. Yet once you accomplish those goals, maybe you feel good and fulfilled for a day, if you're lucky a week, but eventually you always want more. And heroic individualism really keeps you into that game of more, where accomplishments are fleeting and fulfillment is lacking.
So I guess with the principles and with groundedness, you counteract that, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly why this base and this foundation is so important. Groundedness doesn't say that we shouldn't strive to be excellent, that we shouldn't strive to be great. What it says is that if that striving happens without a solid foundation, then it can become very frantic and frenetic, and that energy can turn negative pretty quickly. Whereas if we have a solid foundation to ground us, then our striving becomes more wholesome, more nourishing, more fulfilling, and more sustainable.
So you mentioned that, most people focus too much on peak performance, and, people might think, well, you wrote a book about peak performance before, so now you write about groundedness. And I'm curious, like, how did you come up with the idea or with the, desire to write this book? Like, how did it come to life?
It's a good question, and it's not to say that we shouldn't focus on peak performance and that peak performance isn't really important. It's simply to say that peak performance without a solid foundation is fragile. And I think that in hindsight, it would have been great had I written these books in reverse, but I almost had to write peak performance first to then realize that there's this other part of the mountain that actually occupies a lot more space, that is equally, if not more important. And you asked how I came to realize that. I'd say two ways. One is personally, I had my own big disruptions and challenges in my life that took me out of that peak performance mode and made me realize, like, wow, maybe my foundation wasn't as strong as it could have been. And that got me very interested in, well, what would have a stronger foundation looked like? What are the first principles that I ought to be focusing on now? And I also saw this in a lot of people that I work with as a performance coach, as well as in my reporting and research. So many people that are very conventionally successful on the outside, often on the inside, feel like they're never enough or are struggling to truly be fulfilled. So these people are quote unquote peak performers, but they don't feel that it is sustainable or necessarily the deep outcome that they want. And between my own personal experience and then hearing all this, as well as seeing stats on burnout and quiet quitting and depression and anxiety and all of these syndromes that are at least somewhat related to a lack of deep meaning and fulfillment in our lives, I said, hey, I think there's probably a book here, and it's probably even a more important book than peak performance.
Yeah, totally. And I just wanted to say, I think the timing of the book is also on point, because I think these topics are more important than ever before. Like mental health and everything just plays such a big role in society these days. And more people are aware of it and, talking about it openly and stuff like that. So I think it's a great topic to write about during these times right now. And one thing from the intro that I found really, really interesting, because it's so simple, is a formula that you shared about happiness. Can you share that with the listeners?
Yeah, it really is a wonderful formula. And it is that happiness equals reality minus expectations. So if your expectations are way out of sync with reality, especially if they're way better than reality, then you won't be happy. So if you go through life with quote unquote positive thinking or rose-tinted glasses and life gets hard, you'll be more upset than if you just accept that, hey, sometimes life is really hard. So a big example of this is very recent on my mind. I don't know when this podcast will come out, but we're recording shortly after the midterm elections in the United States. And I had a very kind of doomsday view about how those were going to go. I thought that America's democracy was really up for grabs, and I wasn't convinced that the outcome was going to be good. My expectations were low. Well, it turns out that not only did democracy hold, but many candidates that support democracy did great. So I woke up the next morning after the election and I was happier than I've been in months. And it's simply because I thought it was going to be a massacre, and it actually turned out to be pretty good. Now, does this mean that we should go around thinking that everything's going to be terrible? No, that's no fun way to live a life. It does mean that the more realistic we can get with our expectations, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm from Germany, so I don't really have an idea about the elections in the US, to be honest, but I like that story. And I just wanted to ask, we could just walk around with low expectations of everything, but that's a sad way to live, as you said. So we kind of have to find the balance, and there's a fine line to that. but it's a very great lesson and takeaway from the book that I took early on.
Thanks. There's research from the Scandinavian countries, in the Nordic countries, that they're quite happy, their populations. And when social scientists look deeply into this, what they find is that people in those countries have very low expectations. It's just a part of the culture. Again, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but as a writer, I think it's very interesting to point out. And personally, where I come out at is it's not about setting poor expectations, but it's about being realistic. And especially here in the West, we're often told, again, that everything should be perfect and we should be happy always and we should be, delusionally almost optimistic. And what the research shows is that that really hurts how we feel. And it hurts our performance, because if you're not seeing things clearly, well, then it's impossible to make progress on them in a lasting way.
Yeah, you have to be aware of, setbacks or risks that you might take or things that could go wrong when you do certain things. I totally agree. It's not necessarily about being pessimistic or optimistic. It's kind of being
realistic in a way, you know? Yeah, seeing
Yeah.
clearly is how I like to say it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So to get into the principles, there are 6 of them, and I want to kind of go into them a little bit for each one, so the listeners get a sense of what you cover in the book. So the first one is about acceptance, and one thing that I really loved that you shared is that we should remove the word should from our vocabulary. Why is that?
Well, there's a common saying, which is don't shit all over yourself. And the way I like to think about it is don't should all over yourself either. So should is a very judgment-laden word. And the way that we talk to ourselves, our self-talk really shapes our reality. So if we're constantly saying we should do this, we should do that, that's pretty rough. I mean, imagine telling your wife or husband or partner or girlfriend or boyfriend, you should do this, you should do that. The relationship wouldn't last very long. Yeah, we talk to ourselves like that a lot. And I think that we should strive to replace the word should with want or wish. And if we can't do that, well, then maybe perhaps we ought to question what we actually want in the first place. So someone's like, I should go to the gym more often. Well, do you want to go to the gym more often? Do you wish that you could? And if neither of those things are true, then maybe drop the weight of that judgment altogether. So that's why I like that heuristic. Don't shit all over yourself.
Yeah, and I totally agree that it's so important how we talk to ourselves. And I don't know where I read or heard about this, but I even heard someone say, you could also frame it in a way where you say, I get to go to the gym, like it's a privilege kind of, because I'm physically able or whatever to do it, I can financially afford to do it or stuff like that. So yeah, that was a great lesson. And yeah, so acceptance, one more thing that I thought was very interesting, because in each chapter you share practices. First, you kind of share some theory, I'd say, or explain the principle, and then you share a couple practices that people can actually do to include that practice into their daily lives. And one that I found interesting from the first chapter was cultivating the lens of a wise observer. So what is that all about?
Right. So when we find ourselves in challenging or exciting or emotionally arousing situations, it can be very easy to fuse with those situations. And what I mean by that is it's the difference between watching an action movie where you might be really into it, but there's still some space between you and what's happening, versus being in the action movie. You're the one being chased. There's no space. And I think that it's really important that we have an ability to zoom out, especially when we're making big decisions or when we're in the midst of significant challenges, and create that space, because within that space, we can choose wisely what to do next instead of just be kind of taken over by the inertia of what we're experiencing. So the lens of a wise observer is really all about creating some space between you or your awareness of what's happening and the situation. And there's a few ways to do this. The most commonly discussed is probably meditation, right? Where you learn how to see thoughts as just thoughts and feelings are just feelings. You're non-attached to them. You can observe them. For those that don't meditate, there's two other ways that I really like. One is to visualize that a close friend is in the exact same situation that you're in, and then give advice to that close friend. We tend to see a lot more clearly when it's our friends going through something than ourselves. And the other way to do it is to imagine that you are 10, 20, maybe even 30 years down the road, and you're looking back on current you and your current situation. Well, what would the older, wiser version of you tell yourself to do? Both of these strategies fall under what psychologists call self-distancing. And it's just that. You create some distance between yourself and your experience.
Yeah, and it's so relatable. I mean, when you shared that, I just thought about it. I so often catch myself, when I talk to friends, I'm like, well, it's so obvious what's the thing to do, what the right decision would be in your case. And then I catch myself in certain situations where I can't decide or I don't really know what to do. And I'm like, well, if it would be a friend, it would be so much easier.
But then the hard part is actually following that advice. So it's like,
right.
If let's say you're a runner and you really love running and you get injured and you're like hobbling out the door to go on a run. Well, if you saw a friend hobbling out the door injured to go on a run, you would tell that friend you should rest. It's better to miss a day or two now than get really hurt and have to miss a month later. Well, then you have to take that same advice yourself and actually shut things down and rest.
Yeah, totally. But then also you're the one, who has to deal with the consequences then. And that also there's another factor that when you talk about a friend, you don't have to deal with the consequences. So it's easier to decide. Yeah. But I like that example. And I want to pick up right there because I am actually a runner. And one thing that I saw, which I loved, was that Eliud Kipchoge mentioned your book after his world record run in Berlin. It was just like 1.5 months ago. So did you know about this? Like, did you know that he was reading your book?
I had no idea. So I am a huge fan of athletics. And that was a total surprise. I got a text message from a friend that simply said, wow, you've made it. And it was just a link to an article in a Kenyan outlet with Eliud Kipchoge on the cover. And I'm thinking I have no idea what he's talking about. So, because I love Eliud Kipchoge. I mean, any fan of sport loves Eliud Kipchoge. And then the first time I had heard about it was when I opened and I read the article, and then it had a link to this video of a press conference where they asked him what book inspired him. And he said, my book. I've never spoken to Eliud Kipchoge. I had no idea he was reading my book. I will say that after I found out, I was able to hunt down his agent's email address. So I've emailed his agent, or maybe it's actually his manager, and I'm hoping that Eliud is open to talking to me. So Eliud, if you're listening to The Power of Books, I'd love to talk about my book with you. That would really be a treat. That was a career high for me, man, because again, as a fan of sport, anyone that knows sport knows that Eliud is just the GOAT. He's the greatest ever.
Yeah, man, that's, as you said, it's very great. And I kind of want to ask this as a fun question. What do you think was his favorite principle, or the one that helped him the most to achieve this world record?
Well, I think it was probably either patience or community. So patience, Eliud is, these aren't necessarily things that helped him, but maybe things that reiterated what he already does or gave him that extra confidence that he's doing it right. Not that he needs any extra confidence from me. Eliud is very, very, very restrained. So in his training, he very rarely trains super hard. He's very patient. And in his racing, he lets the race come to him. He doesn't necessarily push the pace super early, particularly if he doesn't have to. And then, of course, community, Eliud, like so many other great Kenyan runners, they train in groups. They don't train individually. They do most of their training runs with their fellow athletes and neighbors. And I think that there's huge benefit in both of those things. So my guess is they were the principles about how being patient ironically gets you there faster, and how deep community is key to strength and stability.
I love that answer. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm curious what you think he would have liked most in the book.
Oh, I actually didn't think about that. But, well, so you have the last principle is movement. So, obviously he has to move and it's like part of his life and everything. So I would say that plays kind of the biggest role. But then from the other principles, I totally agree with the patience because I don't know for how many years he has been training for this, but, it doesn't come overnight or anything. So, yeah, I think patience would be a big one right here. Yeah. So let's jump to that one actually, because that's we for the listeners. We're gonna skip the second one, which is to be present, and go to the third principle, which is about being patient. Because you say be patient, and you'll get there faster, which is interesting. So obviously, patience doesn't just mean waiting for stuff to happen. So what does it mean instead?
Right. It means that we overestimate how much we can get done in one day, and we underestimate how much we can get done in a year. That's the simplest way to say it. So we often think that if we just push harder and harder and harder in the acute moment, then we'll get so much done. Whereas the truth is, it's much better to stop a little bit short every day and be consistent and string together consistent efforts over time. So back to Eliud Kipchoge. If he went to the well in his training every day, he would be injured, he'd be fatigued, he would not be consistent. So part of what makes Eliud so great is, like I mentioned, he has the ability to restrain himself and maybe only push 80-85% effort. But what that allows him to do is show up for training every single day, in his case, over the case of decades. So patience is really about not getting so caught up in the excitement of the moment and having restraint in saying, hey, what's the best decision I can make? Not necessarily for how much I can get done today, but for what will help me be consistent over the long haul.
And that relates to what you also say in the book, is to stop one rep short. Essentially, not every time you work out, for example, not put everything out there and then leave nothing in the tank, and then you probably won't be able to train the next day, or it's going to affect your performance in the future, kind of. And I'm interested because, there are other people who say, well, you should always give everything. And there's, you probably know him in the book, The Power of One More, Ed Milet. He's all about doing one more rep every time. So I'm curious, why do you think, or what's your take on that? Why do you think it's not a sustainable approach?
I mean, I'm very data driven. So there are a lot of great motivational writers that can give a great pep talk, and they don't look at the data, just to be totally frank. So yeah, if you're about to go to the gym, I can tell you to crush it and go to the well and not leave anything out there, and you got one more in you. But I mean, if I told you to do that every single day, there's no way you'd do it. You'd get injured or you'd burn out. So research from every single domain, be it the arts, intellect, or sport, shows that the performers that have the best, longest careers are all very consistent, and the way that they're consistent is they pick their spots. So in training, I call it going to see God, or going to the well. And maybe you go see God or you go to the well 4 times a year, but that's it. Otherwise, you have to stop short. Why? The injury risk is too high. Same things in my own writing life. There are certain days when I get in the zone and I can write for 8 hours straight. But if I tried to do that every day, I would absolutely burn out. So it's really about a difference between viewing the time horizon as one workout or one writing session or one work day versus a year, 5 years, or a decade. So again, I think ultimately there's a difference between a pep talk and a motivational speech and then what actually works.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I hope Ed Milet doesn't come kick my ass because I just said that.
Oh, no. It's not the only thing. It's not just about doing one more rep every time you train. The book and the principle he shares is about a lot more, which doesn't isn't in contrast to what you're saying. So that's just one example. So I'm sure he won't be angry at you or anything. What would you say to people? How can we train our patience? Or how can we become more patient?
It's tricky. One of the ways that I like best is to go places without any digital device. So if you're at grocery store, go to the grocery store and don't bring your phone. if you're going to go on a walk with your dog, don't bring your phone. Don't bring your music. Because what happens is when we start to get a little bit bored or restless, we turn to these devices. In the book, I call them adult pacifiers. And being patient requires being able to sit there with nothing in front of us, no next move or no immediate next move. And I think a big part of the reason that we're not patient is because we've become accustomed to just having constant stimulation always. And if we can put ourselves in situations where we turn some of that down or off, we can retrain our patience. So that's one skill. Another skill to think about is, and it's funny because we were just talking, you know, when you buy a book on Amazon, normally it's at your door 5 hours later at most a day. But could you buy a book from your local bookstore and order it and wait 5 days for it to come? So I'm not saying you should always do that. Sometimes you're really jazzed up, you're motivated, you need or you want the book, but just trying to find spots to deliberately go a little bit slower where we've gotten accustomed to going really fast. And then the other way that we can train patience is a very simple technique, but simple does not mean easy. And I call this 3x5 breathing. So 3 times a day, stop what you're doing and just take 5 deep breaths with your eyes closed. And people think that's easy, but it's hard. I struggle with this because if we're go, next thing, well, why would we pause and take 5 deep breaths? And it's different than meditation because meditation you do once and it's like a part of your routine or maybe twice. But this is like, you know, in the middle of your day, just stop, take 5 deep breaths. There's a study that I cite in the book where people would rather be shocked with electricity than sit with nothing to do for 15 minutes. So it is hard and it's not going to happen automatically, like you said. That's why we need to train ourselves using some of these tactics and strategies.
And what I find really crazy about, you know, the phone thing, because these days we're so accustomed to it and trained. And if you think about it, not even one generation, or maybe like one generation ago, people didn't have phones. Like these things didn't exist. When you were at a restaurant and the other person was at the bathroom, like you just had to wait, you know, maybe
that's another, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Timo. That's another great time to do it. So I do that all the time. When I'm out to dinner with my wife and she has to go to the bathroom, I don't go on my phone. And it's hard. I feel the urge to. I like start reaching for my pocket. That's
so cool. Yeah, I love that. Because it's crazy. And I've done that before several times, you know, tested it and you kind of feel a tingling in your fingers. You just want to pick up your phone and you're like, no, I can't pick it up, but it's so hard.
That's real.
Yeah. And, you know, when we talk about exercising without the phone, I was actually inspired by Ryan Holiday's Stillness is the Key to do that, because he talks about the importance of, you know, just giving your brain some time to process all the information you take in during the day. And like even today with, you know, audiobooks, podcasts, you could listen to so much stuff while working out. And I mean, it's good, you know, you can learn something. It's like, it's fun, but there's also a time where you should just, you know, keep your, leave your phone at home. And I usually do that when I go for a run, because when running, it's really a good time to kind of go inwards and tune into your body and, you know, enjoy the nature if you run in a park or somewhere or in a forest. So I love that you also picked that up, and I think people should really do that if they feel like they're constantly bombarded with like input, and if they constantly have their phone around.
Yeah, I really like how you say that. It doesn't have to be always. It's about picking your spots and making a practice out of those spots.
Yeah, right. Because, for example, when I go to the gym, you know, I sometimes take my phone with me, listen to some music, or sometimes even a podcast. But I said, you know, running, usually, most of the time, I do it without my phone. So as you said, it doesn't have to be always on, or no, not at all. So, yeah. To get to the next principle, or one more principle that I want to cover, is actually the one that you mentioned. You also mentioned about Elliot, is deep community, because that was one that was kind of surprising for me, because I didn't expect it to be there, you know. And what I found really interesting is when you explained why community is actually important for us, because I didn't know that. Could you maybe go into detail a little bit, like what does it make with us, you know, physically and mentally?
Right. So we are wired, our species as humans, to need to belong to a group or a tribe or a community. And this traces itself back to our ancient ancestors. So if you were alone on the savannah, right, when we were evolving from our fellow primates to humans, to Homo sapiens, and you weren't in a community, you were at a huge survival disadvantage. Because if you couldn't find food, no one would share the food with you. There'd be no one around. You would die. If there was a predator, a lion or a tiger, it would pick you off. It wouldn't be deterred because you weren't in a big group. So the humans that survived were the humans that were able to forge community and stay in big groups. So it is in our DNA to feel comfortable and to feel safe and secure when we're in groups. Now, a big part of heroic individualism, hence the name, says that, well, you don't really need community. You can go at it alone, or at the very least, productivity is more important than people. But if we don't make time for community building and friendships and people, we start to feel really anxious. At least most people do. And why is that? Well, again, it's in our evolution. If we're alone and we feel isolated, we become scared. So it's the community that actually gives us strength to sustain ourselves through big challenges. And ironically, it's generally the first thing that gets cut when people get way too focused on optimization acutely. So all these principles go hand in hand. If you're patient, you can have time to build community. And if you build community, it helps you win in the long game because you have this enormous support. Whereas if you're not patient and you just want to optimize and go, well, then the first thing that gets cut out is that pointless phone call with your friend, or driving to the trailhead instead of running out your door so that you can meet with friends. Again, there's a balance. It's not to say that none of us should work or focus on productivity and we should all just hang out with our friends all the time. But I think that the pendulum has swung quite far in the direction of rote productivity instead of a focus on people.
Yeah, and it's the same, I guess, with the phones. Just a few decades ago, you were not able to do most of the things by yourself. Like, you depended on other people. And today, it's also not totally possible to do everything by yourself, but like, we're getting to a point where you can do more and more just by yourself. You don't have to have other people around. So that's kind of a negative, evolution, but obviously we can still make the time. And let's be honest, it's also way more fun doing things with friends or family than doing it by ourselves. It's just that we're often so focused, as you said, on like peak performance and
and achievement. And the truth is, know, when you talk to people and they're old and they're on their deathbed, no one remembers writing the best-selling book. I shouldn't say they don't remember, but no one mentions that what gave their life meaning was the New York Times bestseller or the London Times bestseller or the Olympic medal. What they say is it was the people that they went on those journeys with and that were there with them for those challenges. Mm-hmm. So here is a good thing. We can have our cake and eat it too, because it doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for big goals, but what it means is the goals that we strive with, we should try to bring others along the way with us to walk the path together, because that gives it so much more meaning and it increases the chances that we succeed. Because if we're having a meaningful experience, and as you say, if we're having fun, well, we're more likely to stick to the thing. It's a lot easier to do hard things when you're having fun and you find meaning.
Right. That's totally right. And that is a good bridge to the last principle, which also is way more fun if you do it in a group. And that's, movement, exercising. So one data point or one statistic that you picked up in the book that really blew my mind and I wanted to ask you about is when you said that, sitting at the desk job in an office and like for 8 hours or more a day is actually really, really bad for us. Because, we are obviously built to move around. We are born to be active and move our bodies and, like in the past, walk miles a day and all this stuff. And nowadays, many of us sit at the desk the entire day. And you mentioned that 8 hours of sitting per day actually puts your risk of dying to a comparable level than obesity and smoking, which is crazy because, you feel like, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I move around, I'm not obese. I should be very healthy. But then you sit at the desk the entire day and it's like, it's almost the same. So that really blew my mind. And I myself have a desk job, working at the computer the entire day. And I'm curious, and I guess most people who listen to this can relate, because now so many people have this. Like, what can we do? What's the best way to kind of still be active or avoid that risk while sitting so long when you have a desk job?
Well, the good news is that the same team of researchers, or the same group of researchers involved in this, have found that short micro movements offset basically all of that risk. So if you're going to sit 8 hours a day, but every hour you go and walk around for 5 minutes, then that risk is almost completely offset. So it's not so much the fact that we sit at a desk job, although being in a chair for 8 hours, that's a long time for anyone, but it's that we also don't ever get up. And there's some very interesting theories in cutting edge science around our metabolism and how even little micro movements, so just doing some calf raises or just swinging your arms, sends a message to your nervous system that, hey, like, we're not dying here. We're actually still alive. We need to regulate our blood sugar and our heart rate and our blood pressure and all these biological pathways. So what I would say is, it's not doomsday if you're in a desk job, but if you can get up throughout the day for these micro movements. Now, there's two ways to do it that I really like. One is to schedule walking meetings. So instead of taking a meeting on Zoom, take it on the phone and walk while you take it. The other is to just constantly be drinking out of a water bottle. One, it keeps you hydrated, which is good, but the other is you have to pee all the time. And if you have to pee all the time, well, that forces you to get up and walk to the bathroom. So I think that that is a very stark and surprising statistic. I felt the same way, but then when I looked into it, I was a little bit less afraid, because what I found is that if we just take care to have these small periods of movement throughout the day, most of that risk is offset.
Yeah, and what I found so interesting about it is that, most people, including myself, just didn't know this. Like, we're not aware that it's so bad for us. Like, we probably know that it's bad, but it's that bad. And it's also good to know that there's a very easy approach, kind of a very easy solution to kind of like really lower the impact this has. So yeah, I to the listeners, I can highly recommend, just getting up every hour or so, as you said, and just move around. And yeah, you will also feel better. It's not just in the long term healthier for you, but
during the day, you'll be more creative. I mean, all this research is in the book, but you'll be more creative, You'll problem solve, you'll have better focus, so on and so forth.
Totally. I just wanted to bring that up. Yeah. So I'm curious, you said that you're a runner, and I think you also lift, but are there any other sports that you love playing or that you enjoy doing with friends or family?
Yeah, I love strength training, and I go to a gym that just has other wonderful people there, so they're always around. And then I also love hiking. So I live in a mountainous area, and I'm so fortunate to have really great access to beautiful trails in the mountains, and I try to get out and hike as much as I can, especially on the weekends.
Yeah, I love that. Hiking is awesome. I live, probably for US distances, I live very close to the Alps here in Europe, so that's awesome, because I also love going hiking there.
What's your nearest entry point into the Alps for you?
That's probably because, that's hard to say, because basically it's like I live in Würzburg, which is in kind of middle of Germany, and then if you go south, you could go like to like the Bavaria direction, so it's kind of like east of the Alps, or you could go like France or Switzerland, which is kind of like west, and it's kind of the same distance. So
yeah,
I can really pick.
Ask because probably my favorite place I've ever been is Chamonix.
Okay, I don't know that one.
Oh, Chamonix is it's this small mountain town, like right at the border of Switzerland and France. And they have a trail race called the UTMB, the Ultra Tour Mont Blanc, and it goes around Mont Blanc, and it's a really neat mountain city. I'm surprised you haven't been there. You should definitely go there. It's really a wonderful place.
Yeah, I've heard of the race actually. I don't know where, but I've heard of it. And
Yeah, so
actually
it starts and finishes in Chamonix.
Oh, that's interesting. I gotta look that up because I haven't been too much in that part. Usually I go to the Austria part, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of the same distance. Exciting, yeah. So for to kind of because we're approaching our like time limit, quote unquote. So I want to kind of wrap things up a little bit with the second part in the book. It's about you share the principles first, and then in the second part you kind of give some advice on how people can include these things in their everyday life. And you make you put it in a great way where you say to stop thinking about doing your things and then start actually doing them. And what would you say is like your, not necessarily the number one tip, but one of the tips that you would give someone who's like, well, and I've heard about this and I want to implement it in my day. So like, what's the best way to go at it?
So knowing is not the same thing as doing. And often we mistake knowing for doing. So you often have to know something before you can do it. But just because you know it, it doesn't mean you're doing it. So you can be an expert on groundedness and read my book 8 times, but if you don't actually start doing the principles, well, then your life probably won't change very much. And I think that the biggest tip there is that motivation follows action, not the other way around. We think that we need to be really motivated and inspired and feel great to get going, but we actually often just need to get going and then the motivation will follow. So I think if you read the book and you have a good understanding of the principles, and maybe in each chapter you pick out the 2 practices that you want to start on, well, expect it to be hard and don't expect to always feel motivated. Making change is very challenging. There's a strong inertia to our habits and our energy of doing the ways we always have been. And just know that you don't have to feel good to get going. Like I said, often you just need to do the thing and then the good feelings will follow.
Yeah, I love that. And also, probably not trying to do everything at once,
Yeah, like you pick 1 or 2 things to focus on and go from there.
Yeah, right. Well, awesome. That's a great tip for people when they want to start. I love that. So one question that I ask every guest who's on here, because the show is called The Power of Books, and I want to highlight, because books can have a huge impact on our life. Obviously, that's why we're talking about yours today. And I'm curious, what were like a few books or the most impactful ones that you've read?
Yeah, so Robert Pirsig's 2 books, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila, are probably the 2 books that have impacted my life most. Another book that is up there is a book called To Have or To Be, and then Escape from Freedom by Eric Fromm. And if I had to pick one more, it would probably be any of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, but The Art of Living is kind of the summary book that he's put together towards the end of his life.
Interesting. I haven't read any of these yet. Like the one that I've heard most about is actually the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle.
Yeah, it's kind of like a cult classic, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Exactly, yeah, that's one.
Yeah, it first came out in 1974, and it's part fiction, part nonfiction, part memoir. It defies categories. Part philosophy. It's a wonderful book. Obviously, it's my favorite book.
What's funny?
I'm a book nerd too, so I appreciate the power of books. I have the cover art from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance tattooed on my right arm.
Really? That's great.
So it's literally imprinted on me.
That's so cool. And yeah, most authors are big readers too, so
yeah, you have to be. I mean, it's what makes a good writer is a good reader.
Yeah.
And books are great.
That's right. What's funny is about the Zen of motorcycle maintenance. The one thing that was always holding me back was that I thought it was actually about maintaining motorcycles. And
I'm no, it's not about motorcycles at all.
I was like, I don't ride motorcycles. I have no idea about them. I will be clueless when I read that book, but I should just get it and read it because it seems valuable. Well, to all the listeners, I'm gonna hold the book in the cover to all the people who watch, actually, and I highly recommend that you check it out. We've talked about a couple principles today, but obviously there are more. I think we skipped 2 or 3, and of course there are more practices, things that people can do and how they can implement it, and all the theoretical background that we just covered briefly today. And I think it's so beautifully written with stories and data. And then I always love books that kind of put a foundation and then tell you how to do that. That you kind of understand why it's important, and then now you need to go do this. And your book does a great job at that. So that's why I really loved reading it. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brad, for coming on today, taking the time. And I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. The feelings are mutual. It was a pleasure getting to talk a little bit about the book with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And to all the listeners, I'll talk to you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.